Ben Rawlence ist ein preisgekrönter Autor, Aktivist und Gründer des Black Mountains College in Wales, das als Reaktion auf die Klima- und Umweltkatastrophe gegründet wurde. Es will kreatives und anpassungsfähiges Denken fördern. Er studierte Geschichte an der School of Oriental and African Studies und machte seinen Master in internationaler Politik an der University of Chicago. Rawlence arbeitete in der Afrika-Abteilung von Human Rights Watch. Er schrieb unter anderem für die New York Times und den Guardian. 2012 erschien sein erstes Buch Radio Congo, Signals of Hope from Africa's Deadliest War und 2016 City of Thorns, 9 Lives in the World's Largest Refugee Camp. Sein letztes Buch, der Tree Line, The Last Forest and the Future of Life on Earth, handelt von der arktischen Waldgrenze der Borealwälder und deren Zerstörung durch Klimawandel, Kolonialismus und Kapitalismus. Neon Green Network präsentiert Ben Rawlence.
Good evening. Guten Abend, Vienna. I'm on the spot. I'm from Wales, which is in the cold, wet northwest corner of Europe. We're not in the European Union anymore, but we are still on the European continent. You can't argue with geography, as we are all finding out. Now, I'm not an academic, I'm not a professor, but I'm here representing a very small new university founded focusing on climate change. But my background, as you've just heard, is as a writer, as a storyteller. And as we know at this moment in history, we need new stories like never before. And that's really what this story that I'm going to tell you about shortly is for. It's about thinking of new stories, new ways of thinking about ourselves and our planet and that relationship between the two. So I'm going to take you on a journey, a very short journey up to Wales, but we're going to go the long way round. So we're going to go to Wales, but we're going to go via Russia, Canada, and Greenland, and we're going to start in Africa. As you saw there, I wrote several previous books about Africa, and about 15 years ago, I was working in the Horn of Africa, covering famine and drought, and what was coming to be called at that time, climate-driven conflict in the Horn of Africa. Now, I came back to the UK, and I was curious, what's going to happen here in Europe if we're seeing these kinds of effects in a very sensitive place in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel region already? And I started to ask questions. And the more I researched, the more alarmed I became. And one of the most alarming things I came across was this concept of the trees moving north. Not the individual trees moving, but the forest as a whole moving north, turning the white Arctic green. And I thought, wow, how come I've never heard of this before? Other people need to know about this as well. I want to tell other people about this. So I went north to the Arctic, and the first place I went was to Norway. And I phoned up the head of the Sami Reindeer Herding Association in a town called Kautokeino, and I said, I'm interested in the tree line, in the moving trees. Can you tell me anything about that? And the guy on the other end of the phone started laughing. He said, I'm 50 years old. When I was born, the town of Kautokeino was in the middle of the tundra. Now it's in the middle of a forest. This process has been going on for 100 years already, of the forest moving north into the tundra, but we haven't heard about it. So this fact propelled me then around to continue looking into this question. And this next slide is an image from the very farthest north you can get on land in Russia, which is a place called the Taimyr Peninsula, and I was trying to reach the northernmost growing limit of trees. And to get there, you have to fly east of Moscow and then north for a similar amount of time until you get to Katanga, and you drive on the Katanga River for about 3 days in an awful vehicle called a trekol, and possibly you hope to have better companions than I had, which was 2 Russians called Kolya and Kolya. And Kolya like very much weapons and vodka, and they don't believe in climate change. And we drove for 4 days, and finally we got to the northernmost limit of the trees, and we saw these beautiful, tiny larch trees about this high, 400 years old. And we compared the images with the ones I'd been given by scientists 20 years earlier, and it was exactly the same. And Kolya were delighted. They said, "You see, Greta is lying. It's a hoax." But of course, while other forests are moving north, like in Norway, Canada, Alaska, in Siberia, it's still too cold. So the temperature had risen by 30 degrees. The average was no longer minus 60, it was minus 30, but still not enough for the trees to start moving. So Kolya were delighted, and I was very shamed by them, but I was delighted to be there. However, the reason I want to show you this picture again of the trekol is because there was another thing that Kolya did listen to, and that is that in the ice on the river, we came across bubbles. And if you put a pin in the bubbles and you light it with a cigarette lighter, you get a flame. And that's because these bubbles contain methane. And you've all heard of permafrost melting on land, but the permafrost on the ocean is way more scary because it doesn't have the covering of trees and of snow. And now that we're losing the polar ice, the sun's rays heat that black seabed, and they heat it up, and it releases more methane much faster than what's happening on land. So this, for me, was another big moment. Why had I not heard about this before? What does this mean? These things like, these tipping points like permafrost, like the Gulf Stream system of currents in the Atlantic, these are very big Earth systems which move very slowly. So the real lesson from that journey around the Arctic Circle, and from there I went to Alaska, to Canada, to Greenland, and then back home to Wales. I would love to stay here for an hour and tell you the stories of all of those places because they're wonderful. But please read the book instead if you'd like to find those out. But the thing I want to emphasize is, having made that journey, I was struck by a couple of things. Firstly, as we say in American, holy cow. I think in German the word is Scheiße. We are in deep Scheiße. We are in deep shit. This is a big problem. And we can't slow this down. We can't stop this from happening. We can slow it down, but we can't stop it from happening. So what do we do? What does that mean in practice? Part of the reason why we're in such a mess, part of the reason why we hear the same thing from our leaders again and again about net zero, about the challenge of climate change, and yet nobody seems able to deliver political change, is because this is not just a scientific problem. It's not just a political problem to be solved with policies. This is a problem of values, of culture, in fact, it's the coda of a 500-year journey of European civilization that has taken us away from nature, that has caused us to see ourselves as separate from nature. It's an intractable problem. And I have a lot of sympathy for politicians, that some of whom I used to work with, who have tried to make change, but who are working in a political environment which is constrained by our society, our economic habits. We are all unsustainable. We are wearing unsustainable things. We are eating unsustainable things every day. And therefore, that brought me then to the question of my own action. What can I do now with this understanding, having met all of these, in many cases, indigenous communities living in the forest, whose culture and way of life was being challenged by the changes that are underway. And I came to the conclusion that this is about culture. At the same time, I was a young parent. I've got two young daughters, thinking, if this is a problem of culture, and I am living in an unsustainable culture, and the job of being a parent is about transmission of culture, then how do I interrupt that process? How do I stop transmitting an unsustainable culture to my children? And how do we as a society stop transmitting an unsustainable culture to our children? We have to somehow interrupt that transmission. We have to do things differently. So that's where I came upon the principle of education. Education is also about transmission. That is the place where we inculcate morals and values and ethics, where we teach people to think critically, teach our young people to think critically about the world, and to try and imagine their role in the future, and to try and imagine the world differently. So, having worked in journalism and human rights and politics, and working at that front line of policy change, I took a step back. I went back to the woods, or back to the roots. And in Wales, I founded this college called Black Mountains College, which is designed to try and reimagine education for an era of climate change. Essentially, we're trying to reimagine the society that we want to have after climate change. Because this process is, as I said, unstoppable. The only question mark is how fast it moves and how much the amount of change. And what that means in practice, in terms of the kind of education that we're building there, is that we have to redefine not just what we teach, but also how we teach and where we teach. So you may have heard of this concept of head, hands, and heart. Learning is not just about the logos, the words, the things that happen between the things that happen in your head. You have to engage emotion, you have to engage practical experience at the same time. So we teach outside as much as possible, where nature is the classroom. It's the fundamental principle of the forest school movement. Some people have called Black Mountains College Forest School for Grown-ups. That's a fair description. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to teach outside in nature, because if we want to be reimagining a new way of doing things for a new kind of civilization, then we need to be doing it in nature. We need to see ourselves as part of nature. And we also then need to be learning from nature. So that other part about the experiential learning is how we learn with our whole bodies. The other thing is the subject. So climate literacy, why did I not know about the boreal forest? Why was that not taught to me in school? Why did I not even understand about climate change until I started to do my own research? What failure of the media, the government, the public education programs had led to a supposedly intelligent man, aged 30-something, not knowing these fundamental facts. Article 12 of the Paris Treaty places a duty on governments to undertake public education. The UN report says no government is actively fulfilling that criteria. So climate literacy, just as important as numeracy and as linguistic literacy. So we put that at the heart of our curriculum. We teach in this holistic way, and we teach in nature outside. So altogether, what that does is it creates, we hope, we've only a year into year 4, we've got 80 students, we're hoping for many more, but what we hope that creates is young people who have a different sense of their role in the world, the different sense of their relationship to nature, and a different sense of their relationship with each other, with their peers. Because there are some other fundamental principles that we can learn from nature, from the forest. And one of them is thinking like a forest. Now, you're familiar with the classic interpretation of evolution that Darwin put forward, that we have selfish genes and we have a competitive evolutionary spirit which leads to speciation and the survival of the fittest. Now, recent research in forest ecology turns that theory on its head, because actually the species which are surviving best in the forest are the ones which are collaborating best, are the ones which have co-evolved with other species to develop resilience, to develop networks, partnerships, which give them strength when the going gets tough. You may have heard of a phrase called the World Wide Web, the Wood Wide Web. The Wood Wide Web is about the way in which these trees connect to each other under the ground. They look after each other when the going is tough. And in some cases, in the case of pines in Scotland, the granny pines, the old trees, will transfer carbon when they are young and when they're growing to their young. But when they get old, the transfer happens in reverse. The young trees look after the older trees and supply them with carbon as they get old. Now, each individual plant is only as strong, and in fact lives longer, in a vibrant forest where it is supported by a network. Does that sound familiar? From your own communities, from your own towns. These are the kinds of relationships, these are the kinds of patterns and systems that we need to build. So as well as climate literacy, social and political literacy is at the heart of what we teach. Because for better or worse, our leaders have failed us. Who around us here, who in this room, sees a government that is acting at the speed and the scale that's required, that we all know is required? I don't see any hands, but exactly. I don't either. So what this means is it's up to us, it's up to local, municipal, individual and community groups and networks to build resilience, because the storms that you've had in Austria, that we are having this week in Wales, that the Americans have had over the last few weeks, are nothing compared to the ones which are coming. And there is nothing we're going to be able to do to stop that. We might be able to slow it down. We might be able to reduce the intensity of some of those future storms. But be very clear, the Earth is not getting colder, it's only getting hotter, and there's nothing we can do to reverse that. We can slow it, getting hotter, but we can't reverse where we are now. So that's why thinking like a forest is so important. Building the networks, building the mycelium, if you like, amongst ourselves, both in our communities, but more broadly, whether welcome to Wales, or wherever you are across borders. So that community, that resilience resides in that community. And the last point I'd like to make is that the revolution has to be fun. When the students are coming to us, they're choosing to come to the middle of nowhere, to a cold, wet mountain in a tiny village with 3 pubs, with no cinema, with no lattes and fancy shops. But they love it because we are imagining our own fun. We are imagining new ways of doing things. We are challenging ourselves not to eat plastic, to drink plastic, to wear plastic, to wash plastic away through our washing machines. We're challenging ourselves to lower our emissions, to do things differently, to reimagine systems within our village, within our local area, and indeed at the national level as well. And we're having a lot of fun doing it. So my last plea is, whatever you're doing, try and make sure it's more fun than the other guys. Thank you very much.
Vielen herzlichen Dank, Ben Rawlence.